Oh, don't sue me. But yeah. So if you got anything, let me know now. I'm gonna erase everything and go from there. But all right. So like I said, we have this little digression about experimental techniques because the question becomes, how do you study development? It's kind of hard because it's a time-sensitive process. It's not like exit polls in a presidential race where you're looking for an answer that matters now. Who did you vote for? Whom did you vote for? So if you're looking at development, you really want to know the difference between a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old in all of these important axes. So there's 3 types of studies we can talk about. The first is the longitudinal. The longitudinal study basically means I'm going to take a group of people, measure them at time A, measure them again at time B, and then see what differences come about over that time. So I have the same group of people. Members of the group don't change. If they fall out of the study, boo-hoo. We just ignore their data. So this allows you to determine differences within a group. So if you're saying for people of this demographic background, for example, we can say that there are these differences between 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds. But it's very hard to generalize those results to other groups. So if you're talking about a study of affluent white kids, does that same development apply to minorities from lesser socioeconomic status? That's a legitimate question. Cross-sectional. Cross-sectional. This refers to you're studying different groups at the same time. So it's a little hard to think about how this applies to developmental psych. But let's say you're an educational psychologist, and you're trying to see, does preschool make a difference in how 4-year-olds act? So if you're answering that question from a cross-sectional perspective, you're going to measure 4-year-olds that are in preschool and 4-year-olds that aren't in preschool, and you're going to compare the differences between the two and say, okay, preschool does this. Now, if there's some kind of factor that makes it more likely for someone to attend preschool, you might miss that. But that's the idea, right? So maybe people who go to preschool are naturally more affluent and have better outcomes to begin with, and you conflate that with being in preschool, and then you have a bad study, but it's there. Your third and final is a sequential study. This is the combination of the other two. So longitudinal, you're taking the same group over time. Cross-sectional, you're taking more than one group at the same time. So for this, you're taking more than one group at more than one time. This is super expensive, but it lets you account for differences within a group and differences between groups, which is cool. And as long as you don't have any factor, like if you have something where, okay, well, let's say with our longitudinal example, right, for preschool, if you're using it longitudinally, maybe there was like an act passed when the kid was 3 that changed the way that education was done. So you're comparing 2 to 4, and you say it's preschool, it doesn't work. Sequential says as long as there's nothing that's both time and group dependent. So you could think of that like memorizing it. You could think of it as if there's some factor that differs by a different amount for each group over the passage of time. If you have something like that, that can cast out in the sequential study. But that's less of a that's less of a concern than longitudinal, where it's just if you have any difference between the time, you're SOL, or cross-sectional, where if there's pre-existing differences between groups, you can't account for it. Here you can do that as long as it's not varying both over time and between groups. So sequential studies are difficult and expensive and not great, but if you can pull it off, that's amazing. Okay. Next thing we're going to talk about is biological brain development. So this is much more neuroscience, right? How do we actually know how you grow up? It's kind of weird. We kind of know what happens to your brain in between 0 and 20. There's a lot. So when you're originally born, when an infant is originally born, you have a lot of empty space in your head. It's the cranial space, right? So cranial space would be like the socket inside your skull. And there's more physiology here that I'm not getting into, but the socket inside your skull is actually only like 25% filled with brain. The rest of it is just cerebrospinal fluid that helps to recycle waste but doesn't give you any processing power like brain does. Only 25%. It's kind of weird when you think about that. Like, why were you born so early? It seems like you were taken off the production line before you were done, but that is a pretty drastic development. It's even more drastic when you compare in between which parts of the brain. So if you remember all the way back to when I was talking about neuroscience, right? We had that caudal rostral axis. So the caudal stuff was closer to your spinal cord, so like brainstem more so, cerebellum. That was the really basic, evolutionarily ancient stuff. And the more rostral stuff towards the beak or snout, roster, Latin, was the really special stuff. Things like higher order processing and language capacity, things that make humans unique. So the really caudal stuff, your hindbrain, your midbrain, is relatively well developed, but the forebrain is just mush when you're born. And there's almost nothing of that higher order structure, but you have a lot of these primitive, more survival-based structures once you're born. By the time that you hit 2, all of a sudden, about 75 to 80% of your brain space, your cranial cavity, is filled with brain. 25 versus 75. That's a huge difference if you think about it. Or if you don't, it's just a huge difference regardless. But that's just to show you how much development is there. And obviously, development is going to be more focused on the rostral stuff, the forebrain, the diencephalon, so the thalamus stuff, and especially the cerebral cortex, because that's what was mostly lacking before. But even age 2. Once you hit age 2, you start to get this pruning process. Pruning, like the fruit. So before you hit age 2, your brain is kind of forming synapses left and right like crazy. So remember, synapses are what are responsible for each thought you have, each memory you have, all that good, each reflex you have, all that good stuff. Well, most reflexes are spinal cord synaptic, not brain, whatever. You're forming a whole bunch of connections between neurons, and basically you're waiting for you're waiting for some time to pass to see which one of these connections are really relevant to my daily life, which one of these connections just aren't. So if it's a connection I formed because I saw it once when I was on vacation and then never saw it again, okay, that can go. That can be pruned. But if it's, the memory of my mom's face and I see that every day, that's not getting pruned. So the idea is you're eliminating synapses that don't get used too often. So memories you don't think about too much. Terms for ideas and concepts that you never see, right? They get pruned. So, okay, going back to infant stuff, I always put the toddler stuff before going back to the infant stuff because it gives you a sense of how much development there is and how that infant to toddler phase is kind of just a crazy construction phase. We're not really critical about what we're building. We're just going to build everything because we don't have any personal history that we can compare the experience of our lives to yet. We need that to know what's important. So going back to infant discussions now, infants have pretty good hearing, but their vision is trash. They can't see anything. Infants actually lose they don't have the ability to see color until a little while after they're born. And if you know, like, okay, 20/20 is really good vision. 20/50 is what most contact or glasses owners use. 2500 is your average infant visual acuity. That's garbage. Like, You can't see anything. You are entirely dependent on your caregiver. And most animals aren't like that. Most animals come out about where we would be at like age 6 in terms of development. But some terms to know with especially the study of infants is there's two types of understanding to know. There's intermodal understanding and there's temporal understanding. And these are referring to two different very fundamental processes when you're trying to make sense of the world. Intermodal understanding is the ability to associate and combine different senses inputs. So if I see everything rapidly coming towards me and I feel like a wind coming from under me and I'm looking down and I just see the ground coming at me, I probably fell, right? And we can make that conclusion by synthesizing the feeling of falling, like my feet aren't touching the ground anymore. There's visuals of falling. The ground is coming very much closer to me, or more realistically, I am coming closer to the ground. The sound of falling, you could think of. All these kinds of things we piece together. Infants literally can't do that until they're 4 or 5 months old. They literally can't. And you can imagine, like, if you can't do that, what would life be like? It's just this all these disconnected sensations bombarding you and you can't make sense of any of it. It kind of sounds like torture. But that's how every infant was. That's how I was. And you don't remember it. But to me, that sounds traumatic. Like you have no control. You can't even make sense of what's going around you, let alone have any control. I think that sounds horrifying. Temporal understanding is the ability to differentiate objects in time. Did I talk to this person 2 days ago or a week ago? Again, infants literally can't do that until the same age, 4 or 5 months. So as if it's bad enough that you can't synthesize everything that's going on hitting you at one time, you can't even distinguish that from what happened a month ago, if you happen to remember it. Again, it's just you have no control. You can't make sense of anything. You just have to hope that whoever your primary caregiver is can take charge. I think, again, to me, that's horrifying. But what can I say? I'm glad I'm not an infant anymore. One thing infants can do, even when they're just born, if they see something enough, even if they can't say when they saw it, or they can't say that it's the same thing that they're hearing or feeling, if they see something enough, they'll habituate to it, which means that it's going to evoke less of a neural response, right? Like if I were taking a house tour of my family's house and I went into this room, something like the color of the wall would really come out at me. I'd be actively considering it. But now that I do all my work in this room and I kind of live in this room, the color of the wall I've seen so much, it doesn't strike me at all. It's not interesting. It doesn't grab my attention. It's just there. But if you were doing a tour of my house and you've never seen it, so what's actually happening is I'm habituating to that. Infants can do that too. They might not be able to say what something is or when it happened, but they can determine the number of times they've seen something. There is an exception, and that is to a face. You will get the same neural response to a face from an infant every time. And there's some evidence that the similar is true for people who aren't infants. We are profoundly social animals, and I don't know any other way to prove that that's better than that. Okay. One last term with infant development is attachment. I think this is something we talk about more later in this unit, so I won't get into the weeds now. But you're forming an emotional attachment. I use the word to define the word. You're forming an emotional bond with a caregiver, mama, right? The idea here is that this is a fundamental need that you just obviously the infant is helpless for all the reasons we just talked about. They need that bond to survive. There's also evidence that even if you are well fed, right, if you're like a rat in a cage but you have no caregiver, it's going to seriously mess you up. Modern relationship psychology is actually based on the same idea that everyone needs some kind of attachment fundamentally. This isn't in your class, so you're free to erase your notes or whatever. But that's the actual idea. Like when you go to couples therapy, The idea is we're going to treat this as an attachment that you form to the other person. So anything that makes you feel like you're less secure in your attachment, oh, you didn't hear that. Anything that makes you feel like you're less secure in your attachment, we're going to treat that as an issue that this couples therapy session needs to overcome. So it's tempting to say, oh, it's just infants. Infants are so cute and helpless. But we kind of all need it. We just need it in different ways. We don't need, breast milk and someone to see things for us anymore, I hope. But, there's a need that transcends just sustenance and survival for an attachment. Okay. Jumping way ahead of what we were talking about earlier, the prefrontal cortex. So again, we're talking about the more rostral, developmentally advanced parts of the brain. It develops all the way until you're about 28, 27 to 28. There's a lot of implications here. One, it's kind of common knowledge that once you exit adolescence, you go through puberty, you've gone through all that, you get out of high school, maybe you get out of college, you're kind of set in who you are. No, you still got 6 more years. One of the reasons that a lot of scientists are more alarmist about things like teenage drug use and things like that is that we don't know how it messes with the 27 to 28 year prefrontal cortex development. We have no idea. We also have no idea how something like Adderall, there's no study on how Adderall, and I think Andre said this, is how I know it. So maybe it's less groundbreaking to you. We have no idea how that interacts with the actual progression of development. So, but we do know it takes a really long time and longer than we think. So if you can't do something now, maybe you just aren't biologically ready for it, and you will be in 9 years. That's a legit excuse you can have. It's a biological basis of being mature. You might also call it a maturational change as you get older and make better decisions. It's maturational because remember, maturation is biological. But the idea is you're not stupid because you're young. You just are bound to the neural processing power that you have at the time. Seems to slightly impinge on the idea of free will, or at least the idea of unqualified free will, but that's beyond the scope of this tutoring session, so I won't get there. All right, that's the last bit about biology in this for now. Any questions, let me know. I'm going to start erasing. Okay, our next little bit before our break, we should talk about Piaget's theory of just development in general, and then we'll get into he has a moral theory that we get into later, but I guess your heading here would be this Jean Piaget guy. He's really the first one to tackle this developmental psychology. This is like, I think, 1920s around the time. So that's part of the reason we talk about it. Not everything here is correct, but a lot of it is a pretty good insight. So I talked about this in passing, but for Piaget, infants live with this concrete here and now understanding of the world. I can't make sense of it. I can't connect the past to the present because I don't even know what's past and present. I'm just going to take whatever sensations I'm being lobbed at, whatever sensations are cooking around my brain at the time, and I'm just going to try to live for the present, YOLO, right? That's how infants think to Piaget. And again, there's evidence for that. Adults have a much more symbolic and abstract conception of reality. It's not just what I've encountered now, it's how does that play into my past. I have the ability to understand abstract ideas because I can connect. I can synthesize ideas across modalities of the senses. So that's a fundamental difference that we're talking about here. Piaget has 2 terms that you should know, like immediately: assimilation and accommodation. All right, what are those? So assimilation is the way in which you bring external ideas into internal cognitive schemas. So that's a really abstract idea, bring external ideas into internal cognitive schemas. I think an example helps, right? You're learning to play, I don't, let's say like you're watching a basketball game, right? You're watching a basketball game and you you don't really know what basketball is, but you get the gist. So you're learning more and more. Okay, I see an external stimulus, right? I see that all the players dribble the ball. So then you're kind of saying, well, dribbling the ball, I know that's basketball. I've learned that. I've learned that. I know that. So if I see someone dribbling the ball, I can assimilate that information into my basketball schema. Accommodation is when you alter your existing schema to make sense of things that you didn't know before. So your basketball schema might be able to accommodate dribbling or assimilate dribbling, but the idea of a 2 versus 3-point shot might be foreign to you. So when you encounter that idea, you can't just fit that into basketball because your basketball schema has no conception of 2 or 3 points. But you only ever see 2 or 3-point shots in basketball. Therefore, the infant's brain makes the realization that the best course of action is to change what I think about basketball so that it includes 2 and 3-point shots. That is accommodation. It's kind of weird because usually when I think of accommodating, I think of fitting something into something that's already there, but that's what accommodation is. Assimilation is fitting the outside into the inside without changing the inside. Accommodation is making minor piecemeal adjustments to what's inside to accommodate what's outside. Cool. Next term is this process of equilibration. Equilibrium. And Piaget argues that after a certain point, the world becomes so radically new that assimilation and accommodation break down. And this happens several times over the course of a young person's life. So at that point, the cognitive system kind of resets. We are going to build entirely new schema to understand the world because I can't just modify everything. An example would be first day of preschool, right? Your schema of how other people fit into your life is largely just parents and neighbors up to this point. But now you have to fit all of these people from school, all these fellow kids from school into those schemas. Well, are they really neighbors? That doesn't really work. They're clearly something different. They're clearly not your parents or family. So we're just going to say nuke it, scrap it. I'm going to create an entirely new schema for friends from school. There you go. But equilibration is a much more broad idea. It's like everything breaks down. So you go to school, your idea of what is acceptable behavior breaks down entirely, right? Maybe lunchtime at school has very different rules from lunchtime at home. And you can't just make minor modifications like, oh, I'm probably not supposed to talk that loud. Oh, I'm supposed to raise my hand in class. You have to come up with an entirely new schema. You get the idea. Piaget has 4 stages of development that he talks about. So the 4 stages, the first is the sensory motor stage. Cool. Again, I'll define these, so leave yourself some space. The second is your pre-operational stage. The third is your concrete operational stage. Again, don't worry if you don't catch these, we will get back to them. And the fourth is your formal operational stage. So what these terms are all designed to do is connect specific patterns of behavior with like specific stages of development. Okay, you could have figured that out on your own. You didn't need me to tell you that. What actually are these? Sensory motor stage is your first stage of development. This is the infant, right? We talked about how you have these transient, disconnected physical sensations. I'm not making sense of what's going on around me, but I'm moving and I'm sensing. I'm not really thinking because I literally can't. But I'm moving and I'm sensing and I'm sensory motoring, right? You're focusing much more on physiological movements, reflexes, things that require very little upper order cognitive processing. A key point here is, well, two key points. One, you have what's called an egocentric viewpoint. So you think that everyone sees the world the way you do. So that it doesn't just mean that you're self-absorbed. It means if you're playing peekaboo, right? And your dad does the hands covering my eyes thing, your dad can't see anything, right? Because that's how peekaboo works until you do that. But to the infant thinks that the dad can see exactly what the infant sees, even when eyes are shut like that. Or, if an infant can see around a corner, but the parent can't, then the infant assumes that the parent can see around that corner. It's just like there's no conception that other people could be different from me. No conception at all. The second is disconnection from time. Again, you don't have temporal understanding until 4 or 5 months old. You really have no idea at all what time is. And it's not like, oh, haha, since quarantine started, I can't tell what day it is. It's like, did this happen before or after this? I have no clue. It's not just like I've got a case of the Mondays, It's you have no idea how time works. It kind of goes, but since you can't really tell past from present, good luck. Sensory motor stage. Oh, I'm sorry. Pre-operational stage is your next stage. This is very rudimentary mental operations and symbolic thought. You're starting to be able to piece things together from the outside world. So when I see the large gray thing going across the floor and I hear a loud whirring sound, that's the vacuum cleaner, right? I'm able to synthesize all those things. So we have that basic understanding of how the world works, and that's cool. Symbolic thought is still very, very concrete. Something like the idea of justice wouldn't fit in. Maybe we could say in each case, what's the fair treatment? But we can't say like fairness as an abstract concept, but you're getting there. You're getting there. Pre-operational is marked by what's known as a centration task. So basically, centration means that you're tunnel visioning on one part of a problem, neglecting other important aspects. So this is best illustrated with an example, right? You have 2 containers of water. Well, we'll say one of them is our dry erase cleaner and one of them is our marker. They're both of the same volume, so we know that there's the same number of moles of water molecules or whatever, same number of water molecules, same amount of water. One of them, though, is shorter and rounder. The other one is thinner and taller. So, when you're in this situation, right, which one of our containers here has more water? Well, obviously, we know they have the same amount. You could pour one container into the other to demonstrate that, to say that they have the exact same amount of water. But the toddler is going to centrate on one aspect of the task. Usually it's height, which is taller. So if the marker's taller, even though they should have the same amount of water, the toddler's going to say, that one has more water. Or you could focus on the width of you can focus on like the width, right? So this one is a much wider barrel. The point is, you don't have the ability to tie all these things together. The marker is taller, but it's also thinner, has less water per inch. You can't tie those things together yet. You just can't. You're not old enough. You are pre-operational. You are centrating. Concrete operational stage is your third stage. You're finally starting to get these abstractions of essence. So you're starting to be able to tell the essence of the water problem is how much water is in everything, not how tall the container is. You're able to tie these things together and make good of it. Maybe the idea of fairness becomes something you can actually handle, right? The idea that something is fair versus in this moment, the pre-operational child knew it's kind of BS that my friend got 2 grapes and I got 1. But you can say that is part of a broader theme that fairness is good. You start to see abstractions of essence in this concrete operational stage. Centration's going away, but you can't handle totally abstract things. Freedom. I know what it means not to be in timeout. I know what that means, but I can't link that to other things that have this essence of freedom to it. I'm still kind of stuck. I'm concrete operational. I'm not abstract operational. Cool. Finally, we have our formal operational stage. So at this point, we can handle fully abstract concept. Justice, freedom. We can bind all these different concrete events together and say there's a common theme, a common principle, and that is what we're concerned with. That's really the only difference between formal and concrete operational. But it's a big difference. You know, being able to say these things are the same color. There might be two different things, but maybe you can't connect them before at least concrete operational. Now this. You get the idea. All right, so concrete or all this Piaget stuff, it has its limitations. In terms of contributions, we could say it's the first theory of cognitive development. So if we didn't have a theory before this, we didn't know how to study it, right? That kind of makes it hard to study. This is our first time that anyone really sat down and said, how do minds work as they grow up? And it also has a lot of, it's very applicable, even if it was after Piaget's time that we learned these things. It meshes well with these biological aspects of the development where you don't have the neural circuitry necessary to comprehend abstract ideas. And Piaget kind of approximates that with the idea of a stage, right? Cool. Some limitations is it tends to underestimate the capabilities of young people. Those centration tasks only fail when the toddler is not interested at all in what's going on. Maybe the infant can't pull it off at all, but it tends to underestimate the powers that young kids have. It also tends to place too much credence, too much trust in this totally stepwise, discrete model of development, right? So no growth, no growth, no growth. Oh, wow, no growth, no growth, no growth. Process of equilibration, no growth, no growth, no growth. Oh, up, no growth, no growth, right? Obviously, it's a mix. So Piaget says, he kind of implies there's kind of nothing going on during these stages except continuous assimilation and accommodation. It's only once those break down, they equilibrate, that you reach a new stage. So is there really no cognitive development between a 1.5-year-old and 2-year-old? That's BS. But it's interesting. Okay, that is Piaget. We will get back to him when we talk about moral development, and he has some hot takes there. But it is 9:17, so as is custom, I'm gonna sit around for like 20 seconds in case anyone of you have any questions. But you have your 5-minute break. If you have any objections to me erasing, speak very soon. Okay. All right, and I will be back in a moment. So do whatever you need. We'll start up around 9:18. Or no, I'm sorry, that's now. Like 9:23, 9:25, something like that. All right, it's 24, so I think we can start back up. We have a few more. We have a few more theories of this social development to talk about. So we talked about Piaget's. Piaget's was the first. It was reasonably effective, but it's certainly not the only one. Our first theory of development, or our second theory, I guess, is this really kind of strange ethological. Let's call it either an ethological or evolutionary theory of social development. So basically, the idea here is you have this very Darwinian focus on things will develop, A, what will develop, and B, at what time will it develop. Development will take place in a way that best addresses the survival needs that people have, but also B, something a little bit less Darwinian, is the shared fears that people have. So it's kind of interesting, like, why does everyone fear the dark, right? Because that's something that some people have to develop, but some people don't. Like, is that something that we have innately? Do we develop that fear just because it's generally dangerous to be in the cave of a hibernating bear and not know it? There's also some focus on like social contract theory. I don't really buy that kind of thing, but the idea of like we are all working together so that we can do more together than we all would as individual individual persons. It's kind of there's a whole bunch of theories that fall under this realm, so it's a little hard to say like exactly what it is, but I think that you're getting the gist of it from many perspectives. We talked about attachment already, so I don't think I need to restate that. Next up, oh, you knew it was coming. The Freud theory, instinct drive. Luckily, this one isn't quite as crazy as the last one, so we're in business. So basically, again, we're talking about sexual and aggressive drives and how they conflict with social norms. So Freud doesn't really acknowledge how social norms form in the first place. His goal is to say, how do people in the modern day enter society and develop as social persons? That's his goal. How do you channel or sublimate your sexuality and aggression into forms that are less dangerously conceived? So that's a developmental process, right? That takes time. That takes experience. So that's why we talk about it here. And a very important subset comes from a student of Freud's named Erik Erikson, which is simultaneously a great and a terrible name. So basically, you could consider this guy like a neo-Freudian. He has a lot of aspects of Freud in that he's concerned about biological drives, and especially the aggressive drive. They share that. But he kind of substitutes the focus on the sexual drive for focus on a social drive. So instead of being focused on copulating and reproducing, we're focusing now on fitting in with other people and forming a society. But he still cares a lot about aggression, and he still has, as we'll see, a psychosocial stage development model. But you get the idea. He's Freudian insofar as he's focusing on drives and needs, but he changes which needs we focus on. So he has his 8 psychosocial stages of development. So psychosocial, I forgot how to spell for a second there. Development, devd. And they're very similar to Freud's earlier psychosexual model in that they cover specific periods of time that are like sensitive windows with fixation. So our first one, basic trust versus mistrust. He's working off the idea that you have to trust your caregiver, right? And there are people whom you should not trust. This is a really important part of development, right? It's a sensitive period to Erikson. And if you're fixated here, You will have excessive credulity or skepticism, meaning you trust too much or trust too little. Go figure. It fits too well. It's almost like it's made up. But that's your first stage. Your second one is autonomy versus shame and doubt. So autonomy versus shame and doubt. That's deep. Idea here is you're focusing on, can you control yourself? Of course, being Freudian, he can't help but point out that toilet training is an important role here. So, do you have the autonomy to be competent in the expulsion of waste? And if you don't, that's going to bring about this shame and doubt. That's the argument that we're making here. Fixation leads to, you guessed it, excessive self-shame and self-doubt. Cool. Our third stage is initiative versus guilt. Okay. So at this point, I'm not telling you the ages because I don't think you need to know them. But at this point, we're probably talking about like age 3 to age 5-ish. At this point, we're focusing on free action and independence. We are no longer literally stuck in our mother's bosom for food. We are no longer unable to see on our own and think on our own and feel on our own. Let's see, can we handle having free will? Which, do we even have it anyway? Open question, but that's not what Erickson's saying. If you're fixated here, you'll produce a debilitating guilt that will prevent you from acting on your own like free will, right? I shouldn't do that. I'll feel terribly guilty. That's the idea. Our fifth stage is competence versus inferiority. All right. So what are we talking about here? So this is a pretty broad stage. This would be like from 5 to 12-ish. You don't even know that, but just so you know, this is when the kids enter school. And when the kids enter school, all of a sudden, their lives are determined by measures of performance, i.e. grades. And you need to be able to develop this sense of productivity, good grades, competence. And if you don't, this is where inferiority complexes and inadequacy spring. If you're fixated, you don't properly progress in this stage. All right, stage whatever this one is. I think it's 5. I can't count. Stage whatever. Identity versus role confusion. These are all in chronological order if that wasn't clear enough. Identity versus role confusion. Okay. So this is adolescence. So you're trying to figure out who you are. You now have the cognitive and personal biological tools to develop an identity. So what will that identity be, is my question. You're starting to focus more on your friends and on peer pressure than on your family, Erickson argues. So you're naturally going to be forming a self-image. If you were formerly just with your family, right, you couldn't really form a self-image. But now you have two different streams of ideas, and you have the ability to think out other streams of ideas. What are you going to do? So if your self-image can form well, you have the mental capacity to do that, great. If not, you're fixated, you're going to have doubt in who you are. The implication being, I guess, that not everyone has that at times, but that is identity versus role confusion. Next up is intimacy versus isolation. Intimacy versus isolation. And in terms of where you are in life, this is probably when you're out of school, maybe you're in college, you're an adult. You're focusing on the extent to which you can form relationships with other people, especially intimate relationships. That can mean sexual intimacy, but remember, Erickson isn't like a pervert like Freud was, so it can also just mean emotional intimacy. At this age, people's parents start going away or dying, and even if they don't, you're not living with them anymore. Can you be vulnerable around other people is the question. You'll see we're getting increasingly philosophical as we go. Do I have people that I can be vulnerable around? To keep the sexual double entendre going, Erickson uses the idea of exposing yourself to other people. Maybe not the best way to word it in 2020, but can you like take risks and open yourself up to other people? That's the idea here. Next up, your second last one is generativity versus stagnation. Generativity versus stagnation. So at this point, right, we are debating whether we are going to have kids or not. Are we generative? Do we have kids? Generate new life? You're also focusing at that point when you think, Erickson argues, you're thinking about making new life. It becomes a time to really reflect on your life. You could think of this as the midlife crisis, but is your life meaningful? Are you making the world better? Are you really doing the best with the time that you increasingly realize is limited? So generativity can refer to generating new life. It can also refer to generating something positive in society. The eighth and final psychosocial stage is integrity versus despair. Whoa. A little bit different than toilet training at this stage. It's a little bit less instinct and drive focused towards the end here, you'll notice. Freud was always like, your drives determine who you are. This started out that way, but it's less so now. Now you are looking in a past tense stage. You stand on the precipice of death. Your perspective is enormous. You are looking on the past of your life as was. So you can think of this as old age. Did I live a life that was united in its goals? So integrity in this case comes from the older version of, did it all fit together? Does it integrate into something? More so than, being good, although that does play a role. Did I let my values dictate my life, or did I let the exigencies of life dictate my values? Again, that's a really profound question. At this point, though, there's no outs. If your answer to the question of would I live my life over again is no, you kind of run out of time to fix it. You're in the nursing home. But these are the kind of fundamental questions that you're grasping at this stage. And it's almost lost the social element of the psychosocial stage, but fixation can't really do something because this stage never really ends. It goes to the end of your life, and then, oops. Okay. Our last little theory, so this is no longer Erickson. Our last theory about social development is the cultural theory. All right. So the cultural theory of social development is a little bit less do I hate my life than I guess Erickson's was. But basically, what you're focusing on with this cultural theory is the idea that when you're young, you're immediately focused only on the here and now, right? And even if you didn't have that limitation, you are stuck at home. You are quarantined when you don't go to school all the time, right? Maybe you go to extracurriculars, but the point being, you don't really encounter that many environments outside the immediate, what's in front of you. But as time passes, right, you go to school, you start going to more extracurriculars if you happen to have the affluence for that. All these experiences start building up. Now you can start pointing to interrelations between environments. You're developing a sense of culture. Culture being like a unified sense across all environments of what is expected. So maybe at first you're like, I shouldn't say the F word because my mom doesn't like it. But then my teacher doesn't like it, and my coach doesn't like it. So then from all of that, you can start to build a more abstract sense of there's a cultural expectation against saying the F word, right? Eventually, you'll find that social and cultural context build off that interrelation between environments. So the idea here is that your development is limited by the perspective you have on what other people expect of you, if that makes sense. Okay. Our next little dive is into attachment theory. So if you have any questions on what I've discussed, including stop erasing that, Joey, I kind of just took the reins there, didn't I? But if you have any questions on what I discussed, let me know now if anything's unclear. But if not, we can go to attachment. All right, seems like we're all set. So basically, what is attachment? So we talked about attachment as forming an emotional bond to a caregiver, and we talked about attachment as a necessary stage in development. But we haven't really talked about what attachment is or what types of attachment there can be. We haven't really talked about any of that, have we? So let's do that. Um, First off, Freud's take of attachment. So Freud thinks that attachment is this almost like rational exchange where the infant will attach to anything that satisfies its inner needs. I need food. All right, I'm going to form an attachment to anything that I can get food from or, breastfeed on or whatever. Um, so attachment is a consequence of the receipt of resources and it's nothing deeper than that. That's Freud. Freud, even Andre will admit in this case, is wrong. It turns out that social interaction and forming an emotional bond to something is much more than just a biological need. Some evidence from this is if social interaction is purely secondary to physical resource needs, babies never habituating to faces is kind of hard to square because you think after a certain point you're like, oh, that's my mom. My mom gives me food, or my dad gives me food, and then that's the end of the story. Well, why don't you see that habituation then? Clearly, there's something deeper going on. Second, we have this idea of contact comfort, and this goes back to Harry Harlow's experiment with monkeys, right? We know that monkeys and humans are similar evolutionarily, right? Both primates. Why would a so we know that there's a very strong bend towards having physical comfort with somebody, and physical contact is important, far incommensurate to the biological survival value of making physical contact, right? Brushing up against someone's skin is not going to save your life. But it's something we clearly clamor for, and even monkeys clamor for. This Harry Harlow guy, he put monkeys in a situation where they don't have a mother, or well, obviously they do because they had to be born, but they're taken immediately away from their mother. Sad. And they are given two like artificial moms that they can choose from. A like wire one that dispenses water and food, or one with more lifelike fur that accords with what their expectations of a mother is. And they find that the monkey spends way more time with the fur mother just doing, this, brushing up, being vulnerable. So clearly, we can't just say attachment is Freudian and biological. So Freud gets a frowny face on my part. Bad take. Then we get this Bowlby guy, Bowlby. I don't actually know how you pronounce it. He has a much better take. Basically, Bowlby says we form attachments for three reasons. The first being, yeah, we do get food and nutrients and that kind of thing, and that's important. But attachment also brings about contact that is itself pleasurable, like the monkey cuddling against the artificial fur, as opposed to the wire mesh mom that gave resources. And it also lessens these fears that we're born with, right? It is there's a monster in the room, can I sleep with you, mom, kind of attachment. So it's not just food, it's contact for contact's sake and contact for I don't want to be afraid sake. Joey, that made no sense the way you phrased it, but you get the idea. So basically, you have different patterns of attachment in this Bowlby theory. First, 0 to 6 months, the infant can identify the primary caregiver, maybe, but doesn't really care if someone other than the primary caregiver is holding him or her. It's just like, whatever. I haven't really sorted things out yet enough to know that I could be getting abducted right now, right? But around 6 to 8 months, you start to see this separation anxiety, this idea of emotional distress when you're separated from your primary caregiver. We'll talk about the methodology of how these are described later, but actually very soon. But that's around 6 to 8 months that you see that come around. Okay, cool. The way that we know these things is this Ainsworth, it's a very weird way to say something that's very simple. An Ainsworth strange situation paradigm. What the hell does that mean? Okay. So the Ainsworth strange situation paradigm is a research strategy. What we're saying is, put the infant and the primary caregiver in the room, then a stranger will enter, so there's 3 people in the room, then the primary caregiver leaves. So 2, then 3, then 2 people. And you're testing the baby's reaction when the caregiver leaves, and then when the caregiver returns at the very end to put 3 people back. Basically, you're testing separation anxiety. All right, cool. So from this, we've developed these 4 patterns of attachment. So there's a secure attachment. And again, I'll define all these as we go, as is customary. Avoidant attachment. Ambivalent attachment. And disorganized attachment. All right, cool. What does that mean? So, secure we'll start with. This is the most common. Probably about 60% of American infants exhibit this. And what this is marked by is when the caregiver leaves, you may or may not get separation anxiety. You probably do. But there's acknowledgement of the caregiver's return. So you look over the caregiver, you crawl over the caregiver. Those are meaningful gestures when you're an infant and nothing makes any sense to you, right? So secure, we'll see, is actually correlated with success down the road in a lot of ways. It's interesting. The avoidant style is what it sounds like. The infant isn't worried when the caregiver leaves. The infant doesn't really acknowledge the caregiver when the caregiver comes back. This one tends to have very, very poor results later in life. I'm actually an avoidant child, so maybe it's not perfect, or maybe I'm just an idiot. But it's it's interesting how these things play out, even though they only really apply from 6 to 8 months. Ambivalent means you usually do show distress when the caregiver leaves, so there's clearly some separation anxiety, but then you rebuff the soothing attempts from the caregiver upon his or her return. So basically, it's like, make up your mind, kid. Do you want the caregiver to be there with you or not? You're ambivalent. You're 2 different ways. Ambi meaning both. Valent meaning positive and negative. You're considering both positive and negative having the caregiver there. So this one's about 15%, and again, correlation with future outcomes, certainly worse than secure. Disorganized is about 5%. In this case, we have no consistent pattern at all. The infant does how the infant feels, and we have no control over that. That is a disorganized pattern of attachment. So we know that attachment patterns can provide a lot of insight into later life. Our strongest correlations go 5 years out, right? 5 years out, behavior and temperament. So even that biological, emotional sense. All based on attachment style. It doesn't, you wouldn't think it, but the experimental results demonstrate. All right, so a little bit more about Harlow's monkeys. I talked about them in passing earlier, but these guys are the basis of a lot of what I was discussing in terms of theory. So basically, what happens when you isolate a baby monkey from its mother at birth, or its parents at birth? Most dad monkeys don't do that, but 3 months into isolation, there are no adverse effects. You're cool. You can live. You hardly look any different. As long as you're fed and kept safe, cool. 12 months after isolation is a profoundly sad. If you look at videos of this online, the monkey is going to rock back and forth in the corner of the cage in the fetal position, clearly so disturbed by the lack of an attachment. the monkey responds super strongly to stress of any kind, and it's unable to socially interact, and it can't raise children at all. Now remember, monkey lifespans and human lifespans are very different. Humans take a much longer time to cook, so this would be like a 4-year-old probably, or 5-year-old, or 6-year-old even maybe even older. The point is, it's fundamentally important to have these attachments. It's interesting to see what happens when you introduce a therapist monkey or monkeys, try to restore social interaction with these monkeys. So if you put the monkey in isolation for long enough, but then you put it back in the company of same age monkeys, you'll see a full recovery eventually. It takes a while, right? It takes a long time, but you do expect to see a full recovery. We have similar results for orphan children. Children who are orphaned from their parents 3 months after isolation, if it's right from birth, no adverse effects. Cool. Great. 8 months after isolation, the child will be just like the monkey. Rocking in the corner of a room back and forth, incredibly stress susceptible. This is sad. It's interesting because our best evidence from this comes from a quarantine. And like you have to quarantine these orphans because they need to be kept safe because there's nobody really paying attention to them. But they have no social interaction. So they come out and they're emotionless, they're socially withdrawn. To put it mildly, they are fucked up. Okay? All because they couldn't talk to people for 6 months during development. It's really scary. They can't abstractly think at all. But again, like the therapist monkeys, if you repair the orphan kids at a women's home, give them consistent social interaction, you can get some improvements over orphans who are not relocated. Some significant improvement. Might not be as good as you were in the past, but it's quite a bit. So what lessons should we draw from these experiments? Well, infancy and childhood are vital foundations for later social relationships. If they weren't, your social relationships in 20 years would not be predictable from your attachment style. Again, it's not a perfect correlation. I'm avoidant. I'm supposed to be like hella stupid. But basically, like, there's a really strong correlation. And if the only way to justify that is to say that your early childhood experiences, especially in terms of the attachment you can make to a caregiver, are vitally important. Well, I'm sorry, I gotta respond to this. Lesson two is that you learn certain social patterns early through this attachment, and then use those to as a foundation for later ones. So perhaps it's not a coincidence that as someone who's more avoidant, I'm more introverted. I'm not really introverted. I'm more like an ambivert. But like, if I was at birth much less likely to associate with my caregiver, am I as likely to really need that contact with other people? Well, maybe not. Maybe because of this early childhood experience. All right. So that's attachment theory. Now we have some stuff to talk about as regards socialization. So this will be the last thing we do. I'll try to get through all of it. So socialization. First off, what is socialization? Well, this is the process by which children learn thought and behavior patterns characteristic of their societies. Memorizing the Pledge of Allegiance is an excellent example of socialization. But even then, just having general ideas that aren't as overt, like in America, we tend to believe that people earn their station in life, and people who don't do well are probably less worthy of doing well. That's a pervasive social norm, and that is something that's socialized. Is it true? I don't think so. You could debate meritocracy, but it's there, and you have to internalize that from the broader society. That's not like a given. Why do so many people adopt the religion of their parents? Is the same kind of question. Again, maybe religion is true, maybe it's not. I'm not making a comment on that. What I'm saying is that's clearly a socialized, at least in part, a socialized conclusion, right? Because it's such a common theme. So how do you do that? That's not something you can just take for granted. So that's what we're going to talk about now. So we could talk about, there are some similarities in culture that we can say are common across all cultures, and thus when we're talking about socialization, we can generalize that this is true for everyone. So maybe the best example is a meta example. Every culture socializes. So because of that, we could say that socialization befalls every member of a culture, every member of society. But it's very rare for something to be cross-culturally similar across East and West and Global South, things like that. Very rare. So there are cross-cultural differences that mean that people in this group will be socialized differently than people in this group. For example, obedience to authority is much more, it's something that we tend to grade against in our Western liberal society, not like liberalism, liberal conservative, as in like John Locke liberalism. The idea that your fundamental freedom is freedom itself, fundamental freedoms that undergird action. In the East, you have much less of a cultural heritage of that. So when I talk about the East, I talk about places like China and Japan, especially. This India too, to an extent. Basically, to what extent do you have an obedience to authority more like not like baked in, but it's more of a part of the culture. We Westerners are stubborn as hell, right? We don't deal with treading on us particularly well. That's not something you see in a lot of Eastern cultures. So that would be a difference, your orientation to authority. You also have within culture variability. So everyone under the American umbrella, if you're rich or poor, you're going to be raised very differently, right? The poor kid might be taught a series of values based on being more parsimonious and being frugal, not wasting. Rich kid might be more socialized in the maximize your talents. Poor kid might be more in this realm of be safe. Rich might be your best self, right? It's unfortunate that that's true, but it's true. So, okay, we have three mechanisms of socialization, or three theories of socialization that are worth talking about. So the first is reinforcement theory. And this is a very operant conditioning idea. Basically, you internalize that what is rewarded across a society, especially but not exclusively when that reward goes to you, is good, and what is punished is bad. So, going to jail is bad because it is a punishment. Therefore, you assign moral value or disvalue, in this case, based on that fact. If you were treated better for committing crimes, maybe you'd have a positive impact. That's reinforcement theory. Social learning theory. Basically, you are learning from your social environment. You copy what other people do. You kind of try to fit in. You learn from them. Makes sense. Cognitive developmental theory is really not in your test, I don't think, so I'm not going to really go into it. But basically the idea here is that you are fundamentally, don't write this down, but you're like fundamentally altering how the brain develops and how your cognitive structures develop from your socialization. Okay, the last thing that I will be able to get into is a little bit about parenting styles. So parenting is definitely an element of socialization, right? So what style of parenting do you choose? There's three that we can talk about. There is the autocratic style, the the permissive style. So autocratic, permissive, and the authoritative reciprocal. Okay. So basically, leave yourself some space to define these as always, and give some idea of what's going on for each one. Autocratic style, parents have strict, stern control. Kids have no ability to say, this is what I think we should do. you are punished harshly for breaking the rules. This is you had a curfew at 10, you came back at 10:01, no computer for a month kind of thing, right? We find that autocratic children have very poor social outcomes, much more withdrawn, less sociable, less independent, um, more angry. Correlation. So maybe there's an element of, oh, well, people who are authoritative parents who are this more autocratic style, probably more likely to be from a certain background. Whatever. We're just saying correlations. Permissive style, parents basically say, screw it, no rules, run wild. If you want to play with the knife, play with the knife. That's basically the permissive style. The children can more or less do whatever they want. Maybe because the parent does that. Maybe because the parent works 2 jobs and isn't around, right? But actually, we get very similar child outcomes from a permissive versus a autocratic style. Very similar. Lacking in independence, more angry, less sociable, more withdrawn, immature. These are problems. We don't like that. Finally, we have our authoritative reciprocal style. Okay, what is that? Authoritative reciprocal style is, as is always the case in this class, the one with the hyphen that's longer is usually the good one. So parents exercise their power. They're not just saying play with the knife, but the children are allowed to ask questions about the rules, develop those logical skills, and have a dialogue with the parent. Mom, I think I should be able to come back at 10:15 because traffic is worse than you think. Oh, okay, that makes sense. So there's some give and take, but the parents don't say, you know what, screw it, stay out till 5:15 a.m. if you want, right? And children from this parenting style tend to be much more well equipped to deal with the vicissitudes of life. Much more socially competent, more independent, more responsible, all of these good adjectives. And parenting styles that are enacted even at really early ages correlate very strongly with that kid's future involvement, future outcome, even if you take the kid away from those parents. Corporal punishment as a very, very last thing is there's definitely a correlation between getting spanked and being more aggressive later in life. But so psychologists might say we probably shouldn't do this, but they're not going to say you absolutely can't because we know the corporal punishment causes X unfavorable or even favorable outcome. Okay, that's actually all the socialization stuff. So I know I took you a little over time, and I'm sorry. I am forever in your debt for this offense. But basically, I hope we're all set. We got through a lot today, so I'm hoping we can get through everything by the time your 4th exam is, which I think is still during finals week. Correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, I want to get through everything, and ideally without doing too many of the recorded videos, just because I feel like there's a value to showing up. So, okay, that is it from me. I will stick around for a minute if you have questions, but you are free to go. So I hope everything goes well with other tests and everything.
Thank you.